welcome to Board with Paint. Today I'll be showing you how to paint the male and female elf characters from HeroQuest. Just as in the previous episodes, I've already given the miniature a zenithal prime and we're ready to add some paint. The elves have a very light skin tone, so I'm going to start with Vallejo model color Brown Rose. I'll be applying this to the hands and face and any other areas of exposed skin. Next up, we'll paint the cape with Braineater Azure. This, like many of the other Scalecolor paints, possibly will require 2 coats. There are also some bits in front I'm using this color for. Next, we'll put a base coat on the armor of Leadbelcher from Citadel. I'll be going for a really nice, clean, shiny suit of armor here. Next, we'll paint the hair. I'm using Ulthuan Grey for this to give it a sort of white, ashen look to match the game artwork. The leather bits will get a base coat of Bosh Chestnut. This will cover the belt and any pouches around the waist. There's a piece of fabric hanging down the front that I'm painting with Miskatonic Grey, and we will highlight the design on that later. With the base coats complete, we'll move on to some of the details, starting with the eyes. For the whites of the eyes, I'm using Vallejo model color Offwhite. You may find it useful to add a little bit of flow improver in with the paint. This will help it come off the brush more easily and will prevent it from drying on the tip of your brush. Now we'll try to bring out some of the details of the armor. I'm doing this by creating a wash from Rowney Payne's Gray and mixing it with a little bit of water. Then once we've loaded our brush, we wick off any excess moisture on a paper towel. This will give us more control over where the wash goes. I'm applying this over all of the elf's armor, making sure that it flows down into the recesses and doesn't pool on top of any of the flat surfaces. The advantage of using an ink over, say, a wash like Nuln Oil is that the ink won't affect the metallic sheen of the base coat as much. While we wait for that wash to dry, we'll start highlighting the cape. We should be able to get away with a dry brush here because it's such a textured surface. I'm adding some Lendanis Grey to the Braineater Azure base coat. Then I'm brushing paint off on a paper towel until the bristles are dry. We can then brush this over the entire surface of the cape. Since there's very little paint on the brush, it'll come off on the raised areas and should leave the recesses untouched. This is a quick and easy way to highlight, especially textured surfaces. Now I'll add another layer of dry brush by adding a little bit more of the gray into the mix. This is basically being applied the same way, except I'm trying to focus on the more upper areas of the cape. We'll add a little bit more of the gray and repeat this a third time. If it hasn't been obvious so far, I've been switching between the male and female figures for my demonstrations here. We'll boost the upper highlights a little further by using pure Lendanis Grey. While we're still dry brushing, we're going to apply this a little more sparingly over the upturned surfaces. Now I'm just going in and hitting some of the areas that were a little bit more difficult to hit with the dry brush, or to add a little bit extra boost to the highlights where I think it needs it. Now I'll add some highlights to the armor. For this, we'll mix some Runefang Steel into the Leadbelcher. For these highlights, we'll use a more traditional layering approach and try to hit the upturned areas with the lighter color. We'll also want to focus on any hard edges where the light will collect. Here I'm adding highlights to the sword, but note that I'm keeping the middle of the sword dark. This will simulate a non-metallic metal approach even though we're using metallic paints. Now I'm going through and adding another highlight of pure Runefang Steel. Here I'm focusing mostly on the edges of the armor and anything I want especially bright. We'll repeat those same highlights on the sword, being sure to leave that dark area in the middle. And here I'm picking out the entire edge of the sword. I think the bright steel makes it actually look sharper. Now we'll move back to the cape and add some Druchii Violet, and this will just go over the entire area, and we want this to pool in the recesses and not let it collect on any surfaces. This is both going to shade the cape and will tone down our highlights and blend everything together. Even though the hair is very light, we still want to give it a little bit of definition, so I'm using some Citadel contrast paint, Apothecary White. This can just be applied over the entire hair's surface. This will automatically pull in the recesses, but won't affect the overall color of the hair that much. Once the hair is dry, I'm going in with Braineater Azure and painting the headband. Next, I'm going to carefully go in and dot the eyes with a 50 micron black liner pen. These are available at most craft stores, and they can often be more precise than a brush. If you make the dots a little too large, that's fine. We'll cover that up with the skin base tone later. To clean up the transitions for that non-metallic metal effect I'm doing on the sword, I'm taking Leadbelcher and mixing in some flow enhancer with it. Then I'm using that to smooth the transition between the brightest highlights and the darkest darks. Note that we still want the middle of the sword to be the darkest. We'll return to this in a minute, but in the meantime, we'll highlight the leather by adding some flat flesh to the Bosh Chestnut. This just gets applied to any upturned surfaces of the leather. I'm applying this in a couple of layers, adding more flat flesh each time, but also covering a slightly smaller area each time. And now to boost some of the contrast on the sword, I'm mixing some black in with the Leadbelcher and creating a very dark, almost wash consistency that's going to focus in the center of the blade. You can see me try to blend it a little with my finger. This involves going back and forth with the lighter color a few times to get it right. Next, jumping back to the leather, we'll shade it with Agrax Earthshade. This just gets applied over all of the leather surfaces, and we allow it to pull in the recesses. In fact, you can even allow this to pull on some of the flat surfaces to give it more of an aged leather look. The Elves have some potions on their belt. I'm using Jurildyn Turquoise to paint the blue ones. And Genestealer Purple to paint the purple one. I noticed there wasn't much contrast with the purple and cape, so I added a little bit of red to the Genestealer Purple and repainted the potion. Here I'm picking out some of the buckles and snaps on the belt with Runefang Steel. Also notice that I painted the corks of the potions with a light brown off camera. I apologize, I don't remember the exact color I used. I followed this up with a wash of Agrax Earthshade. Now we'll finally return to the skin and start off by applying a wash of Reikland Fleshshade to all of the areas of skin. Be careful around the eyes. It can be helpful to have a nice dark line around the whites of the eyes, but if you get some of the shade on the whites of the eyes, they'll look a little bit bloodshot. Just remember, you can always go back in and repaint it if you make a mistake. While the skin dries, I'm applying some highlights to the glass potion vials with some Offwhite. This is essentially just adding a small vertical line on one side of each potion. Now we'll highlight the hanging part of the tunic by mixing some Offwhite with Miskatonic Grey. And here I'm just following around that raised pattern. The shade of the skin should be dry now, so we'll go back in with the base color, Brown Rose, and apply our first level of highlight. This should cover pretty much everything except the deepest recesses. Pay special attention to the cheekbones, the bridge of the nose, the forehead, and the chin. And of course, the big ears. You'll want to try to pick out each individual finger, but try to leave some darkness in between so that they really stick out. Next, we'll lighten the Brown Rose by adding some Flayed One Flesh and applying a highlight to a smaller portion of the area. This should only be hitting the upturned surfaces and areas of the most amount of highlight. And now we'll repeat this by mixing in a little more Flayed One Flesh. We're covering an even smaller area than before, and on the face we want to focus on what I like to call the sunburn area. So the bridge of the nose, the cheekbones, and the forehead, those are the areas where you get sunburn, which means those are the areas that get the most light. Now we'll try to bring out those runes that are engraved on the sword. To do this, I'm first going to apply some gloss varnish to the entire sword. This will prep the surface for the next step. While the gloss varnish was drying, I painted the base in Hull Red, which is the same color I'm using for all of the heroes. I then decided to add a little more contrast to the hanging part of the tunic by covering the area in Nuln Oil. Here I'm trying to avoid the upper surface of the pattern though. Now back to the sword, where we're going to paint the runes in pure white ink. The gloss varnish should theoretically help the ink flow down into the recesses where we want it. Once the ink is applied down into the runes, I'm using my finger to wipe off any excess that came out of the recesses. This should result in a nice clean inlay of the runes on the sword. And here we have the completed elves. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it this far, I'd appreciate it if you left a like on the video and maybe even subscribe to my channel. Those can go a long way towards supporting the channel and will help me to bring more videos to you. Since this wraps up the heroes from the base set, let me know down in the comments which monsters you'd like to see me paint. Thanks again, and until next time, happy painting.